One man convinced 50,000 strangers to bow before him. He had no army big enough to force them. Not even close. So how'd he do it? Imagine a world with no crowns, no thrones, no policies. No one on earth had the right to command another human being. Then something changed. One person stood above everyone else and claimed authority over thousands. The strange part is not that he claimed it. The strange part is that they believed him. No army was big enough to force an entire civilization to kneel. So how did it happen? How did humans convince themselves to obey someone they could have simply ignored? For most of human history, there were no kings, no queens, no empires. For nearly 200,000 years, humans lived in small bands of hunters and gatherers. 20, 30, maybe 50 people. Everyone knew everyone. Leadership existed, but it looked nothing like power as we understand it today. A skilled hunter might lead a hunt. An elder might settle a dispute. But when the hunt ended, so did the authority. There were no permanent rulers. No one held command over food, land, or other people's lives for life. Many anthropologists studying these societies found something remarkable. They were fiercely equal. If someone tried to dominate the group, tried to give orders like a king, the group had ways of cutting them down. Mockery, isolation, sometimes exile. Early humans, it turns out, were allergic to being ruled. So here is the mystery. A species that spent 200,000 years resisting permanent power eventually built pyramids for single rulers. Went to war for kings they'd never met. Bowed to men they were told were gods. Something happened between the small fire and the golden throne. And it didn't happen through force alone. It happened through something far more powerful and far more permanent. It happened because someone figured out how to convince an entire population that obedience wasn't submission. It was survival. Around 12,000 years ago, something changed the entire trajectory of human life. Agriculture. For the first time, humans could produce more food than they needed to survive that day. That surplus changed everything. And nowhere did its effects show more dramatically than in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, where farming eventually gave rise to the first cities in history. People stopped moving. Villages formed. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Uruk, Eridu, Uar. Uruk alone would grow to house an estimated 40,000 people. Compare that to a hunting band of 30. This wasn't just growth. It was a species entering territory it had never lived in before. But growth brought a problem no hunting band had ever faced. How do you organize thousands of strangers who don't know each other, don't trust each other, and now depend on the same water, the same grain stores, the same land? This is where the first rulers found their opening. Not through swords, through systems. Someone had to decide who received water from the irrigation canals. Someone had to decide how much grain each family could withdraw from the shared storehouse. Someone had to organize labor to build walls strong enough to keep the city safe. The people who took on these roles gained something no hunter leader ever had: dependency. Here is the psychology behind it, and it still works today. When someone controls what people need to survive, people don't just respect them. They need them. The earliest positions of power in Sumer were tied directly to temples, because temples controlled the grain. The priest administrators who managed the harvest weren't seen as bosses. They were seen as protectors. Lose your position as a hunter, and the group finds another hunter. Lose your position as the person controlling the entire city's food supply, and you control the city. This was the first way rulers convinced people to obey. Not through threats, but through need. Obey the man who controls the grain, or starve. But controlling food was only the beginning. It got these early leaders through the door. It did not explain why, generations later, entire populations would accept one family ruling over them for life, as if it were owed to them by nature itself. For that, rulers needed something food could never provide. They needed people to believe. And this is where it gets stranger. Because the next tool these rulers picked up wasn't a weapon at all. It was a story. The greatest rulers in early history did not simply control people's bodies. They controlled people's beliefs. In Sumer, Most rulers were careful about how they framed this. They weren't gods. They were chosen by the gods, appointed to rule on their behalf. It was a subtle but important distinction, and it was usually enough. A handful of Sumerian and Akkadian kings pushed further, actually declaring themselves divine. Naram-Sin of Akkad is the most famous example, the first Mesopotamian king to place a horned crown, a symbol reserved for gods, on his own head. Think about what even the softer claim accomplished. If a king is simply a strong man with soldiers, he can be challenged, fought, replaced. But if a king is chosen by the gods, questioning him is no longer a political act. It becomes a religious one. Disobeying the king now meant disobeying the divine order of the universe itself. Egypt would take this idea further than anywhere else on earth. Egyptian pharaohs weren't just political leaders. They were described as maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic balance between order and chaos. The pharaoh wasn't ruling over Egypt. In the eyes of his people, he was the reason Egypt continued to exist at all. If the Nile flooded on schedule, it was because the pharaoh maintained cosmic order. If crops failed, it wasn't a failure of leadership. It was a disruption in the sacred balance only the king could restore. Belief had done what force never could. It made obedience feel less like submission and more like participation in something greater than yourself. But belief needed to be seen to be believed. This is where symbols entered the story. Crowns, palaces, monuments that took decades to build. Processions where common citizens weren't even permitted to look directly at the ruler's face. Humans are visual creatures. We are wired to associate scale, height, and rarity with power. A man in ordinary clothes, standing among the crowd, is just a man. The same man, elevated on a platform, wearing gold no one else is allowed to wear, surrounded by architecture that dwarfs every home in the city. That man feels like something more than human. The first kings understood something modern psychology would only formally describe thousands of years later. Authority isn't only claimed, it's performed. This person is different from you. This person was always meant to rule. Sargon of Akkad's own inscriptions claim he was born to obscurity, a child set adrift on a river, raised not as royalty, but as a gardener's son. Whether the full story is legend or fact, historians agree on what happened next. Sargon rose from that obscurity to conquer city after city across Mesopotamia, eventually building what many historians consider the world's first empire. But conquest alone didn't hold an empire together. Sargon installed loyal administrators, standardized systems of measurement and record-keeping, and wove his authority into the daily function of each city he controlled. He didn't just conquer people. He organized them into believing his rule was permanent. Not the sword that won the war, but the system that made obedience feel automatic long after the fighting stopped. Centuries later, in Babylon, King Hammurabi took a different approach to the same problem: legitimacy. Hammurabi didn't just issue commands. He carved 282 laws into stone and placed them in public view, laws covering trade, family, property, and punishment. At first glance, this looks like justice, and in some ways it was. But look closer, and you'll see something else: legitimacy engineering. At the top of Hammurabi's stele, the sun god Shamash is shown handing him the rod and ring, ancient symbols of authority and justice. The laws are carved below, but the image above them delivers the real message. Hammurabi isn't just a king who wrote some rules. He is a ruler personally endorsed by God. By tying his authority to divine will, Hammurabi made his rule almost impossible to challenge. You could disagree with a king. It was far harder to disagree with a god. And in Egypt, this idea reached its most extreme form. Pharaohs weren't simply chosen by the gods. They were gods, living incarnations of Horus, destined to become Osiris after death. This belief explains why Egyptian rulers were buried with such staggering wealth. It wasn't vanity. In the eyes of their civilization, a pharaoh's death was not an ending. It was a transition into the divine realm, and his tomb needed to reflect that eternal status. 3 different rulers, 3 different strategies, 1 shared discovery. Obedience doesn't come from fear alone. It comes from convincing people that obeying is simply how the world is supposed to work. Fear can force obedience for a while, but belief can make obedience last for generations. Here's the part most people miss when they think about this history. It's not really about kings at all. Thousands of years later, the thrones are empty. The palaces are ruins. Kings, as absolute divine rulers, have disappeared from most of the world. But something did not disappear. The same instinct that made ancient humans kneel before a man in a golden crown still exists inside every one of us today. We still respond to symbols of authority. We still trust people who appear powerful before we question whether they are. We still follow ideas, movements, and leaders that promise order in a world that often feels chaotic. Think about the last time you trusted someone just because they looked the part. A uniform, a title, a stage. You weren't wrong to notice it. You were running code that's been in the human brain for 5,000 years. The first kings didn't only build kingdoms. They discovered something permanent about human psychology, something every leader, every institution, and every movement since has quietly relied on. They proved that the most powerful throne was never made of gold. It was built inside the human mind. And 200,000 years of resisting rulers couldn't stop it. So the real question isn't how the first king convinced his people. It's what convinces you.